Okay, welcome everyone to ARCI's virtual forum number 27. It's a beautiful fall day here in Northern Illinois. I'm Tom Zaczek, your moderator for today. Today we've got a great agenda for you to see, and what we have is a few simple rules about keeping the thing going smoothly. Is basically, unless you have a question, please stay on mute. And a good piece of advice is you can communicate via the chat window through Zoom, and then at the end you can save the chat file, and any comments or links or questions that get posed and answered in the chat room can be saved to your computer. And if you've got any questions about this whole virtual forum idea, and if you want to make a presentation, please contact us at that email address right there. And please do consider doing that. You can see that we have a schedule for 2024 already lined up. Our next meeting will be January 20th. And a reminder is that we do put this thing on YouTube at a later date. So right now it's being recorded, and Matt will do a few slides and talk about what that means that we're being on YouTube. Matt?
As Tom said, we're on YouTube, and that gives us a few housekeeping rules we need to follow. They're pretty simple. The two key points are we're on YouTube, so anything that's in your presentation will be available for the world to see, so don't put any secrets there. Second, avoid playing copyrighted music for more than a few seconds because that'll get our video knocked off. Here's the link for our YouTube channel. And all of our presentations are indexed. So if you're watching a video, you click the Show More button over here. It'll pull up this window. And then you can click on any of these blue numbers and it'll take you right to the bit you want to watch. If you're interested in seeing an index of all our presentations, we have that as well. You go to the About page, and on the About page, go down to the lower left-hand corner where you'll see full index of presentations. Click on that, and it will take you to a spreadsheet that looks like this. Here's the actual spreadsheet that it takes you to, and you'll see that it is, the initial display here is in date order. But let's say you want to find a presentation by a person's name. Well, it's easy to change the sort. The first thing you do is select all of the content, and to save a little time, I've already done that. And here's an important point: include the first row here that says the titles. Then you go to Data, Sort Range. I like to use Advanced Range Sorting Options, and you click Sort By. And since we have the first row there, it knows what they are. And so it'll say, if I want to go by name, it'll say Sort By Last Name, and I can add another sort by first name, hit Sort, boom. Now the list is sorted by the presenter. If you're looking for something particular, that can be helpful. That's all I got. Tom?
Thank you, Matt. So here's a brief look at our agenda today. And the next thing we're going to do is go through the three major presentations. And while I'm doing this, Matt's going to put up a poll to see if you're going to do a show and tell today. That helps us budget our time. And after the three presentations, we'll do those show and tells, and I know we've got a few lined up for today. And then after that, we'll do an update on the swap meet. Tom Kleinschmidt will do that. And then after that, we'll do our items wanted, items for sale. And if we have time after that, it's just an open session. So with that being said, I'll introduce our first presenter. Tom Kleinschmidt is the president of ARCI, and he's done many presentations for us. And today he's going to talk about Mr. A.C. Gilbert of Erector Set fame. Tom?
So, A.C. Gilbert, we're going to talk about him a bit today, and obviously famous for erector sets. I'm going to spend like no time on erector sets. So, but let me first, I won't call this a disclaimer, but it sort of looks that way. There's a lot of misinformation hanging around, even in printed books, and we're going to talk about one shortly. So I try to do my best to make sure this is all facts and not folklore, but understand that probably the basic premise is correct. There may be some details that are still not correct. I scrubbed this thing a number of times. So first, step one was talking about Mr. Gilbert. He had 150 patents. He was a gold medal Olympian. He's obviously known for making toys. He was a big outdoorsman. He had 3 cabins in various places where he did hunting and fishing and so on. He started out his business as an amateur magician, making magic sets for professional magicians and for amateur magicians. And the Misto Manufacturing was the name of the original company. And the original erector sets, just as a sidebar, were made by Misto Manufacturing until he changed the company name to A.C. Gilbert. And he's got an MD from Yale University in 1909. Because he wanted to be an athletic director at a university, and you needed to be an MD back then to do that. He obviously did the Olympic thing, but he didn't do that. And so we're looking 1884 to 1961. And so we're going to carry on. So he's a very early user of enameled wire, which is really important in the motor world and the electromagnetic world. It's this little round guy on the bottom here with a hook on the top is a standard erector set electromagnet. You can get the windings a lot closer together. You can get more magnetic density, and obviously most of the radios we work on, unless we're back in the 20s, are going to have enameled wire. There's lots of stuff that says A.C. Gilbert or his company invented enameled wire. I couldn't find that. I went through all the patents from A.C. Gilbert that I could find online, whether they were invented by the A.C. Gilbert company, whether they were assigned. I looked under Alfred Gilbert. I looked under A.C. Gilbert. I won't tell you it's completely exhaustive, but there was no enameled wire patent. And there's a gentleman named George Jacobs, which is given credit for it. He doesn't have a patent on it either. So we're still going by information as best as I could find it. So that's just a kind of a technology piece for you. He had an early radio station in New Haven, Connecticut. Again, some accounts have him having the first radio station in Connecticut. He didn't. He maybe had the second one. KDKA started in 1916. He was in 1921, so he was not the earliest adopter of radio. He did Morse code was the original transmission mode, and he basically was kind of a news service, the Gilbert Radio Press. Then the broadcasting was from his factory, and he ran an antenna from the roof of the factory to an existing smokestack. And so that was kind of the radio station side of life. So WCJ was that, but you notice he only had the radio station for just over a year. And we'll get into why that happened in a little while. So let's talk about making radio as a product. The key guy was this guy, Clarence Tuska, down here. Mr. Tuska is, so most of you know who are into early radio, manufactured radios as well. He and A.C. Gilbert were introduced by Hiram Maxim. And Hiram Maxim and Tuska started the ARRL. That's a whole separate topic by itself, but CQ Magazine and ARRL is their invention. So Tuska was a student at the time that he got introduced to AC, and he had a little bit of a commute from Hartford to New Haven by train, and he'd spend time with AC. He enlisted in World War I. But before that, he had developed a trench radio transmitter for Gilbert. Obviously, Gilbert must have made that for the military. He and Gilbert were on completely different pages on manufacturing. Gilbert was into the toy mindset, trying to make things for boys. Tuska was trying to make radios for the general public. So post-World War I, Tuska started his own company, and he thought he'd go down the boy thing too, and he made radio sets for boys, which were completely unsuccessful. But a lot of the components he developed were successful. And he also had an Armstrong regeneration patent. And that's another piece of the story coming up shortly. So Tuska worked with Gilbert until 1923. Any of the radios you see that are conventional radios were likely designed or built by Tuska and marked A.C. Gilbert. And the information I found is Tuska's catalog number 1 had the radio series that Gilbert sold. And he ultimately came out with subsequent catalogs with different products. So here's where Tuska got in trouble. He was building radios in-house, but he had so much demand for conventional radios that he went with outside contractors, and Gilbert built the radios in his factory, and Westinghouse, who had licensed him the Armstrong patent, yelled foul and said, "You can't transfer it to other people." So why they consider that a transfer to other people when you're doing manufacturing, I don't know, but that's the start of the interesting legal problems. So, and as I mentioned here, most of the sets were breadboards. So back to the WCJ radio station, Gilbert had outfitted this New Haven passenger car and took it around mostly the East Coast and into the Midwest to promote his toys. But he also had a radio receiver in there, which is why it was nicknamed the radio car. And so he would demonstrate the radio by being close to his factory where you could pick up the radio station. And at this time period, many people had never heard a radio. They just knew of it maybe, or maybe even didn't know of it. Now, the cheat was he'd get to some place like Michigan, and of course he couldn't pick up his radio station there. So he'd have a portable transmitter with somebody outside the rail car transmitting, but didn't really bother to tell the people that are in the rail car that it wasn't his station from New Haven. But anyway, this is a fairly famous car. It had a big showroom area you could walk through with all the toy products, and it had a conference room at the other end of it where he could hold meetings with people and so on. Tuska was the main author of all of his instructions. In fact, this kind of fuzzy low-res thing down here, you'll see that this pamphlet is by Clarence Tuska under the supervision of Alfred C. Gilbert. Gilbert also was one of the first guys to offer radios in a cabinet rather than as a breadboard. But like a lot of visionary people, he was too early to the market and it wasn't accepted right away. So we all know that became the norm and stuff became fine furniture as well, and so on and so on. But he was a few years ahead of it. So here is one of the toy type products that he made. One of the things you'll see is it says "Hello Boys" up here. You'll see that on all of his advertising. It was always like a boy's best friend with the neatest thing going, whether it be this or any other product, chemistry sets, and so on. Here is, like as it says, it's the wireless telegraph outfit. This is a toy. This is going to fall kind of into the magic world. This is one of these things where you move the box around and you try and get the weighted little objects into the holes, which are in the shape of vacuum tubes. So same thing we would have done as kids, where we had the little weighted things that we rolled around, or the little BBs that you rolled around to get them in all the holes. Same idea. And here is an early breadboard. It seems that all of their conventional radios were a 4000 series model number when I was looking at things. And radiomuseum.org has got a pretty good selection of pictures of these radios. And this is a regen set, single tube, as you can see. So here's one of their cabinet radios. Looks very typical of the time. Again, you see it's a 4000 series model number. And here's another instruction book Notice it's a fairly young fellow here. And again, apologize for the resolution. That was what was available. So part of what started this for me is not only do I mess around with Rector sets and old trains and all kinds of stuff, I got a box of headphones and look what was in there. An AC Gilbert branded headphone. Don't know who made it for them. I haven't looked at every possible kind. It looks like a pretty common design. But yet it was private labeled for AC Gilbert. So how did he get out of the radio business? And this is all quotes from an interview with AC, and I just highlighted a few things, but the bottom line is the litigation was going to kill him. He took a look at it and said, we could probably argue, we could probably win it. It was too much effort. And he called it litigation over use of vacuum tubes, which again, it doesn't completely correlate with the Armstrong patent, but there may have been multiple things going on. I didn't get that deep into it. But basically, he kind of said, toys are our business. We're going to get back into toys. And then he said, I just gave the whole thing to Tuska, our rights and everything. And he shut down the radio station. But he wasn't out of radio in the true sense of the word after all of this. He got onto NBC radio and did a sports talk show. And there's a big AC Gilbert display in the Eli Whitney Museum in Hamden, and maybe that's what we were talking about earlier before the meeting started. And he had an interview with Babe Ruth at the time. And of course, being the promotion guy, he's like, well, if Babe Ruth's talking to me and we're talking about erector sets, obviously then Babe Ruth is endorsing erector sets. Can't be all bad. So that was, again, just kind of how he was wired. So, you know, as we can see, Renaissance kind of guy, businessman, toy maker, but what I showed you here is such a micro amount of anything about AC Gilbert. It's just really a snippet into it. And as I mentioned, there is a lot of stuff about AC Gilbert. There are 2 books written about him. One's an autobiography, The Man Who Lives in Paradise, and the other one, The Man Who Changed How Boys and Toys Were Made. There's also a movie which isn't on here called The Man Who Saved Christmas. So if you want to catch that, you can find out how he argued that erector sets needed to be made during the war so that they'd have engineers after the war. A lot of stuff came off the internet, but I tried to make sure I could verify it. We did get permission to use the likeness of AC Gilbert from the AC Gilbert Historical Society. David Gilbert, one of his descendants, is a principal in that group, and I've met him, and he's a nice fellow. And so that's kind of the short version of it as we have it. So that's all I got. Any questions?
Well, thank you, Tom. That was great.
Thank you.
And as I understand it, you do have a few erector sets, right?
I have a few, yes.
I'm just wondering how rare that wireless telegraph set is. I'm quite fascinated. I made a little kit on my website to let kids build something like that. And it's I've never seen the Gilbert set before. Do they show up on eBay or anywhere?
I would guess they do, but they're not going to be anywhere near as common as erector sets. I can't say I've seen one in person, but if you do, search on the internet, you'll find it. I guess, it'd be a good idea to keep an eye on your favorite websites for that kind of thing. They made a number of toy things that were related to radio into the 50s. I think they had a crystal set that you could build. We were chatting before the meeting that they also had a nuclear energy thing, the little boy's kit. He was working every angle all the time, and so the erector sets paid the bills, and everything else was trying to get more and more variety.
Yeah, I had one of those nuclear things. I think it was made by Gilbert. It allowed you to trace the path of particles. I had a little radiating device in it. It's a round globe. I have to.
What's a little bit of nuclear radiation for the average kid?
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Any other questions for Tom this morning? Okay. Well, thank you, Tom. We look forward to your next presentation down the road. And our next presenter Greg Van Beek has done several presentations for us. And today he's going to show some of his handiwork. He's been restoring a lot of radios lately, and today he's done some Majestic work. So, Greg, I'll let Matt put up your presentation and we'll get going.
Well, thank you, Tom, and I want to especially thank you for all the hard work and effort you put into this PowerPoint presentation for me. You did all the legwork, and I just provided the pictures and things, and you did a fantastic job, so I'm very grateful to you. These are just 3 of the more challenging restorations I've done in the recent last couple of years, and they're not meant to be a comprehensive guide on how to restore these, just mainly what I started with and what I wound up with. You'll see 3 different models up there. That's how they look now. And we'll start the next one to see how they began. This is a Majestic. It's a model 59. It was known as the Studio. When I picked it up, it looked like it does on the left picture there. It was that's basically just the empty shell. The chassis was sitting next to it. And as you can see, it was painted a kind of a pink and baby blue color with like latex house paint. So it was kind of a challenge to get all that stuff removed. Just a little bit of history on this Studio. It was made in 1933 by Grinnell. It had 5 tubes, and the S suffix on the Majestic branded tubes indicated it had a sprayed on tube shield. It was a Majestic had their own special kind of tubes, and this set was no exception. It was 2 bands, and on the right is a little advertisement for the radio. You can see it cost $37.50 new, and it's appreciated in value since then. These are just some publicity photos I found. It's comedian Bob Hope. He was 35 years old, and these pictures were taken in 1938. And what's interesting about it, he has a Majestic Studio sitting on the desk there next to him. And even only 4 years old, it's got the wrong knobs on it already. Somebody must have swiped the knobs off of it, but there's some nice original Zeniths behind him as well. There's a Zenith Walton radio from when it was brand new, and for those who were wondering if those bezels were actually shiny when they were new, that probably answers the question there. Okay, there's how it looked when I got it. It was basically a basket case. Thankfully, all the parts were there. All the screws and the hardware were in a plastic bag inside the cabinet, and picked this up at one of our Wisconsin Antique Radio Club meets. And it was I knew it was going to be a challenge, but I knew it was a desirable radio when it would be finished, and so it was worth the effort to bring it back to life again. And as I mentioned, it was a kind of a challenge to get rid of all that pink and blue paint. I used a wood scraper, a veneer scraper, like I think Tom had demonstrated in one of his earlier videos. Scraped it down and sanded it. And then these pictures are just showing it masked off when I was painting the black tone on it, black toner. And the next slide will show the some of the products I used. I use a lot of Mohawk toners, and those are some of the favorite flavors I use. Of course, I use a bit of wood filler. If you want to go back again, Matt, there we go. I just wanted to point out I use a lacquer sanding sealer before I tone it. A couple of 2 or 3 coats of that, and once it's toned, I use this Ace brand premium clear enamel, and it works well. It's got a fan tip. It gives a nice light coat of enamel over to protect the finish. And one thing about it, it's not caustic like the lacquer enamels will be. It won't attack your decals. So if you have a radio that you put water slide decals on, that stuff is gentle on them. Okay. And that's the final result. A couple of pictures of the sides and the front. Has some very unique knobs. I was happy to find that those were present because they're unobtainable. As you can see, they're star shaped and they're made out of wood. And if that was missing, that would be a challenge to find it. I'll almost have to make them from scratch. There it is, all aglow, and that's how the backside looks. The chassis actually sits sideways in the cabinet. You can see the tubes are pointed towards the right, and the cord kind of sits up on top like that. And way down on the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a tiny little knob, and that's your band switch knob. If you're going to the, I think it was just a police band they had on there. And so that's the first restoration. This is also a Majestic. This is a year older, 1933, known as the treasure chest. And as you can see, it was kind of a basket case again when I got it. There's just some original advertising for the radio. It cost $18.45. It was known as the treasure chest or the pirate's chest. And this, I guess, one of the first novelty radios, I would think. Just some history on that. It was made in 1932. Used the 380 chassis and was known as a Model 381. And this one had some really strange tubes in it. They all had a G suffix, and the G84 rectifier tube is not the same as the standard Type 84, which I found out real quick, because this one only has 4 pins instead of 5. That was a unique Majestic branded tube. And you can see the information on the variations of the tubes. There are certain tubes that you can use to replace some of them, but that was a real head scratcher when I first discovered the tube count on this radio. This was another purchase at one of our Wisconsin Antique Radio Club meets, and I just mentioned that, and that I know some of the Illinois club members make their way up to our meets and vice versa, and there are some unique sets to be had. And this set was coated with a real thin coat of like a repwood type of material. It wasn't veneer, and it just was brittle and crumbling. It must have been stored in a very dry, hot atmosphere, like up in an attic or something. So there was no way to salvage the veneer, so I wound up having to totally re-veneer the entire cabinet. Every single surface had to be re-veneered. And because of that, some of the trim pieces were also made out of repwood, and some of the corner pieces you can see are missing. So as you'll see in the next slide, I took a few liberties. There's some more pictures of the original condition. That's the back side of it, and looking inside. But all those little trim pieces were made out of repwood, and they had to be carefully removed, and a few of them didn't survive the removal. And that's how it looks finished. And like I say, I took a few liberties on it to make it look a little bit more like a treasure chest, because some of those trim pieces were missing. And yes, it's not, it doesn't have the repwood finish anymore, but I think it looks quite acceptable as it is. There's the side. The speaker is enclosed in the lid, and they actually have a cloth on each side. There's the inside, and that's how the bottom looks. You can see the chassis sits upside down. There's a little metal heat shield over the rectifier and output tube. And so it's kind of a compact little unit, but it plays surprisingly well with just 4 tubes. And last but not least, this is the biggest of the Majestic. This is a Model 75 Tombstone. And this I picked up at one of our meets as well. Kind of interesting backstory on that, which we'll get to in the next slide. This was made by Majestic. It's a 7-tube model. It has the I tube. It's got 3 bands. This actually was purchased again at one of our Wisconsin Antique Radio Club meets. It was the last meet held at the terminal. And if you look over on the picture on the right, there's me in the baseball cap looking down at the radio, which was sitting on the floor behind one of the tables there. That was kind of cropped from one of our pictures that Nick took of the meet. What I believe to be, this is the last radio that Joe Halser purchased at one of his meets at the terminal. I was standing next to him when he bought it in March of 2022, and he passed away a month later. And if he wouldn't have nabbed it, I probably would have then. So I was surprised to see it at this last meet at the terminal when they were starting to liquidate his estate. There's just some more pictures of it, how it looked when I got it. There was a lot of veneer missing on it. Despite its shabby looking outside appearance, the chassis was completely recapped when I got it apart, which was surprising. It played very well, and I'm wondering if this may have been the very last radio that Joe Halser, who owned the terminal, may have restored. And inside you can see the substrate was very badly warped. I think this might have been sitting on its side on a damp floor. So the cabinet presented the worst of the challenges on this one. So on this, as I said, a lot of veneer work had to be done. Both sides and the front panels were completely reveneered. And only the dark center portion of the cabinet remains the original finish. And those are some of the Mohawk toners that I used: a medium brown walnut, the dark walnut, perfect brown, light golden oak, and the whiskey rayon grill cloth. I took quite a bit of grill cloth because it has those two side panels that were just basically for show. There's no speaker or anything behind them. And that's the final result on that. The inside of the cabinet was painted its original midnight blue, and the chassis was treated with a rust inhibitor and was painted a machinery gray. I don't like painting chassis a silver color because that silver paint can be conductive. It's not a good thing to have around components. And there's just some pictures of it lighted up. The dial features a lighted pointer that moves up and down across the 3 different bands when you change the band switch, and it aligns with each band. What's kind of neat are these little 3 areas below the main dial showing the volume and tone position. They move as you turn the controls and along with the band switch as selected. And I think that's about all I had for that.
Well, thanks, Greg. That was awesome. You really took on some challenging restorations there. And
They were 3 of the worst for us being challenging, but they're nice radios and they're worth going the effort for.
oh yeah, I found it fascinating about the non-standard tubes
Yeah,
they used.
that was an eye opener. I thought, where am I going to find a tube like that? And then I did some research online. I found that some of those other tube types would replace them, and they did work. But yeah, that one was a head scratcher.
Ted Rogers in Canada was the first North American company that did the spray shields, brought the spray shield technology, and then Majestic was had some tie-ins and got licensing, and they were the leader. I don't know if anybody else in the United States ever did a spray shield tube, but there are also spray shield tubes in Germany and Philips and Holland did them.
Sure. And I think Tom Perera, that's on this call, may know some of those as well. He's knows a lot about German radios.
I don't know a lot about them. I'm sort of focused on enigmas, but I come across a lot of them. Greg,
Yeah,
where you picked up or learned your wood refinishing skills, they're absolutely extraordinary. And it's not a common thing for people to be able to do that. Did you apprentice or how'd you do it?
a lot of trial and error, Tom, and I did some research online. There were some presentations that gave some good tips, and just tried it and saw what I could do. You know, the toning is an art form. It's not like spray painting. You have to be a lot less vigorous with your spraying than like when you're spray painting something. So that's as anybody who did wood toning will attest, that you have to very light misting coats and several of them to get the right shades.
Absolutely amazing.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad you joined us this morning.
Thank you. I'm really happy to. I'll be joining many times in the future. Just sort of discovered this.
Good. Yeah, Tom is a member of the New England Club, and I put out a little message to their members, inviting some of them to join up this morning. So I'm happy to see that he took me up on the offer.
Very much appreciated.
Yeah, that's great. Welcome, Tom. It's always good to have another Tom here, and also from another club too. We have a lot of different clubs tuning in every time we do one of these, so it makes it fun.
Talking about the finishing, yeah, I agree. The cabinets are beautiful. When you're doing the toner lacquer, does the lacquer beneath need to be wet? Like if you have a cabinet, you have a radio that's already finished, and it's years have gone by, can you do toner on top of it?
You can do some touch-up work on it. Yeah, I would recommend using a sanding sealer first, because what happens is that the toner likes to soak in more on dry wood, and the sealer kind of seals that off before you put the toner over the top of it. That's what I found works best. And especially if you have to mask off areas, you want to have the sealer on first, because if you try masking over old veneer, you'll just pull the finish right off, the original finish, because a lot of times it's dry and flaking. And so,
Matt, if you remember the Westinghouse skyscraper console I had at Radio Fest back before COVID, that is an original finish radio that needed some touching up, and I just cleaned the cabinet really well and sprayed on some Mohawk toning lacquer to blend it in. So yeah, it's feasible. And very much to Greg's point, you don't use it like spray paint. I suddenly had this huge run that I had to quickly do an intervention on. So you got to do it in very light layers and just you got to be patient.
Thanks,
and
guys. That's great.
they make a thing called no blush retarder, which is a great thing, because if you do get a bunch of runs or get on too thick, you can spray that on, wipe it off, and start over again. It's not like you have to sand the whole cabinet over again. That's the one saving grace that I found, because it happens, or you'll get a nozzle, it'll start spattering on you, you'll get some little pin marks on it. So
Greg, where do you buy your Mohawk?
I buy it online from a place called Klingspor.
How do you spell it?
Klingspor, Klingspor.
Yeah, maybe you could put that in the chat window later.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I bought it from Mohawk, and short of having to hire a lawyer to sign all the disclaimer paperwork, and of course they charged me a premium price.
Well, I used to buy it from them too, and then the last few orders I had a problem with them. Every time I'd want my order, I wouldn't hear from them for weeks, and then I'd call them up. Oh, we had that on back order. It just came in, so you had to call and beg them to get your order all the time. So finally I found this other source, and they're a lot more expeditious with shipping.
Very good, yeah, because I've been looking for a good source, and that helps. Like, sometimes you see it on Amazon, but that's kind of hit and miss.
Okay, any further questions for Greg? Well, thank you, Greg. I look forward to some more restoration slides in the future. That's it's good teamwork, and for those of you who are reluctant to make a presentation because you don't know how to do PowerPoint, well, here's a case where Greg wasn't familiar with PowerPoint. He sent me the photos. I made some slides for him, and he was able to convey his accomplishments through those slides. And that's kind of what this forum is about, trying to get everyone to be able to contribute in some meaningful way. And myself and Matt and the other members of the virtual forum team are glad to help you make a presentation. So that brings us to our final presentation of the morning, and that's actually me, so I won't have to introduce myself. And today I'm going to talk about this radio. This is a radio that started out as a tube radio, and it ended up being a transistorized radio. And you can see there what it looks like now and what theoretically it was before. I didn't take a picture of the before, but there's the tube layout diagram. So it was kind of your standard portable tube radio with 1 volt tubes. There's a 3 volt tube in there, and it ran off a couple of batteries that you can't get anymore. And then the result was a radio that ran off a 9 volt battery. And what this presentation is about is it's not a typical one for me where I do a restoration and tell you about it. And there's a little more technical stuff in here than usual. It's more about the path I took getting to this point and some of the things I learned, and hopefully I can share those with you. And in the end, I think I'm a better person for it. And I learned a few things about radio design, and I have a radio that works. So what motivated me to do this is I've always been a kit builder. Way back in the day, I built Heath kits and Knight kits and built a few radios from magazine articles when I was young. And along the way, I ran into some articles about replacing tubes with solid state devices. And so got a lot more time now that I'm retired, and being an engineer, I had a lot of curiosity about this. And I still enjoy tearing into things and building things. So that was kind of the background for all of this. But what motivated me to do this presentation was we didn't have one. About a month ago, Matt and I sat down and we had some issues with our scheduling, and we were short a presentation. So I talked to Tom a bit and Matt a bit, and they said, well, you could do one about that. And I hadn't planned on it, but so that kind of was the thing that pushed me to do this presentation. So let's talk about how I got this far. And this was, I don't know, many years ago. I just saved these articles, and I came across them one day, and it's like, hey, I could learn a little bit about this if I studied this a little bit. And these articles were kind of interesting in terms of why people did this. Mainly, they replaced tubes with transistors because a lot of these really old tubes are very expensive and unobtainable. And by doing this, you could also eliminate having to run your radio off of a oddball battery voltage or a battery eliminator. You could just use a standard battery. And then you could also put transistors into tube radios if you wanted to just upgrade their power consumption performance and maybe some of the other noise performance and things like that. And this is something people did maybe 50 years ago when they would take these big boat anchor communication sets and try to make them transistorize. And of course, a real common thing is replacing tube rectifiers with silicon diodes. People do that a lot. It can improve your reliability. There's a lot of pros and cons to doing that, but let's look at these articles that I came across. The first one was a guy had a radiola radio that had a WD11 tube, and you can see that on the left. There's the tube schematic, and he replaced it with a junction field effect transistor and some bias resistors, and changed the supply voltage down to 9 volts, and there it was working just like the original. And so this guy also, in his article, mentioned that he had done this to some other radios as well. The next article was a similar thing, but it was kind of interesting in that the guy actually put an incandescent bulb in there with the JFET, so that as you tweak the filament rheostat, you could change the gain of the circuit, kind of in the same functional way that the filament rheostat would change the gain of the original radio. So this was kind of an interesting thing. And again, they ran it on a lower supply voltage. Looks like 6 and 18 volts. And then there were some articles that were from 50 years ago that, interestingly, both of them dealt with doing a Super Pro receiver. And these were really complicated articles and had a lot of detail, but it got my curiosity up. And what they wanted to do was take advantage of all the cool mechanical and R's and L's and C kind of circuits that were used in tuning the receiver, and use solid state components to get a radio that worked better and consumed less power. So this was very intriguing to me, but the time wasn't right. But I filed these articles away, and time went on. But one thing I learned here was, why were they using junction FETs for this? Why weren't they using bipolar transistors, which is a different kind of transistor? And the reason is that junction field effect transistors and the metal oxide silicon field effect transistors act very similar to vacuum tubes in the way their bias voltages work and their curves of how the outputs current changes with respect to the input voltage. And so this made the conversions very easy for these old radios. And bipolar junction transistors, those don't have the same characteristics. In the next slide, I'll talk about that a little bit. But what was interesting here is it brought up a point that historically, the first transistorized radios that showed up in the United States were junction transistors. They were bipolar junction transistors and not FETs. And the simple reason why they weren't FETs is nobody was making FETs. They were too hard to make. And so the first many years of transistor radio production was from BJTs of silicon or germanium. And the other interesting historical note I came across here was the guys who invented the bipolar junction transistor, you can see their names there, they were actually trying to build a FET when they stumbled upon making a junction transistor. So the first junction transistors were the result of a bunch of work trying to invent a FET. So this next slide is a little more technical than maybe we're used to on the forum here, but it's basically intended to show that a tube here on the left and a junction FET or a MOSFET operate in the same sort of manner as opposed to a bipolar junction transistor, which doesn't operate that way. And the highlight here is on a tube, you put a voltage on the grid and you change the current flow through the plate to the cathode. That's exactly how a junction FET works. You change the voltage on the gate and the current changes from drain to source in a very similar manner. It's not the way a junction transistor works. You have to pump a current into the base, so you need a current source to get a current to change in the collector to the emitter. So this is a current amplifier, and these two devices on the left here, the tube and the JFET, are called transconductance devices. And you don't talk about gain in these, you talk about transconductance in terms of modes, which is ohms spelled differently. So that was the interesting thing that kind of became very clear to me then when these guys were doing this back 40 and 50 years ago, is they were using JFETs. So this all sat in my mind for a long time. And then a few years ago, I was looking at something on the Radio Museum because I was working on this Grundig, and this guy made this comment about how he put a 500 volt depletion mode MOSFET into a set to directly replace a pentode, and he didn't have to change the plate voltage in the set. So this was kind of like an eye-opener to me that there were FETs like this. And so I went and got one of these FETs, and I built it into an octal tube base, and I went to one of my radios, and it had a 1C5 in it. And I took that, and I put that in my Zenith radio, and after tinkering around with the bias resistor, it worked. It was great. And so here's what I did. I took this FET and a bias resistor, and I plugged it into the output tube socket, and it worked great. And so, you know, I had this technical curiosity, and I went and did this, and I felt good about it. And this is what it sort of looked like schematically. So here's the radio, and basically plugged it right into the socket. The tube and the FET have very similar transfer characteristics, and it worked great. I mean, it didn't work perfect, but it worked. I did try to put it over here in the IF amplifier, and it didn't work. And I realized what was going on there was that there's tuned circuits hanging on this thing, and capacitance of the tube and the capacitance of my FET circuit weren't quite the same, so it was detuning things. And rather than try to pursue this and add capacitors, muck with the radio, I just left it at that. I took my little simple success of the output tube, and I put that on a shelf, and I was happy. And then some more time went by. And then along the way, a few years ago, I bought this book. This guy, Ronald Kwan, wrote this really interesting to me book about how to build your own little transistor radios. And it was very inspirational to me, and I built a few of his designs, and I had a lot of fun doing this, and it kind of set the table for the rest of this presentation. And only a few years went by this time. So this spring, suddenly, I had this idea. I'm going to go take this radio that I've been saving around. I'm sure we all have things we've been saving for one reason or another, but this one I've been saving. And I said, this would be a good candidate to experiment. So I did this. I said, I'm going to do this radio. I'm going to turn it into a solid state radio. And it's a kind of a standard super het radio. It's got 5 tubes and a selenium rectifier. So it's essentially an all-American 6 type design. And compared to like a standard AA5 or a 5-tube design, it's got that extra RF tube in the front. And that's a real important thing if you want to talk about a little bit extra sensitivity and selectivity. Those two terms are not interchangeable. And what it means is the sensitivity means that you can pull in some weak stations, and the selectivity part means that you can discriminate between stations that are relatively close to one another. So this was a pretty good radio, and I managed to find the schematic for it. So I went and I said, well, how am I going to approach this? And these articles that I highlighted earlier said, hey, if you really want to do something like this, make sure you got a working radio when you start. And I think that's really good advice. And they say, just take it from the front, replace the RF section and make sure that works. And then just work your way down to the output section. So I said, that's what I'm going to do. And I decided to use JFETs as my main amplifier building block. And I was going to use a 9-volt battery. And I also decided to use surface mount components. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then I also decided that ultimately I would remove all the parts that weren't associated with tuning and the speaker. So I left the loop antenna, the condensers, and the coils, and the two IF transformers. So at this point, I decided that, okay, I better study this a little bit. And I decided, okay, I better understand all this stuff a little bit better. So I'm passing along some of the things I learned, and I'm showing a block diagram of a superhet, a basic superhet. And what I'm doing here is not maybe typical for the virtual forum, but I'm getting a little technical. And so in this picture here in front of you, every colored area is a tube and in a typical AA6 radio. And so if you have an AA5, what they typically do is they take the RF section and the mixer oscillator and they put it all into one section. And when you do that, you kind of eliminate this filter. So you don't have as much selectivity. Sometimes the mixer oscillator gets split out and there's another tube that's just the oscillator. So there's all these different architectures, but this is the one I started with. And another thing that I learned about heterodyning is, and again, this is called a superhet. So the key word here is heterodyning. That's the mixing that goes on in this thing. And what heterodyning is it takes the RF signal coming in and it mixes it with the oscillator. And you get two results. You get a sum, so you get the oscillator frequency plus the radio frequency coming in, and you get a difference between the two. And the filtering that's downstream from the mixer is it's just looking for one of these. It's looking for the difference in this particular architecture. And the sum gets rejected. Now, one thing that I kind of learned, and won't dwell on it here, but if you don't have good filtering here, you can get images from real radio stations that come and show up where you don't want them because of the sum frequency that shows up. And we won't talk about that here, but that's just an important thing that I learned. So here we got these functional areas that are going to map into this radio I'm going to tear apart. And this is kind of how they lay on the schematic. And you can see that there's kind of one tube for every colored area. In this case, there's a selenium rectifier in the power section. And then here's how these sections map onto the hardware that I was about to tear apart. So kind of highlighted in the with the yellow is these functional areas, and then the tubes are the green where they are, and then the resonant components in blue here. And so this is what I started with, and I made sure the radio worked, and I went out on the internet and some of my books and things, and I found schematics that use JFETs for the amplifiers and oscillators and mixer. And I very carefully started out by building an RF amplifier with a single JFET and a small printed circuit board. I tested it on my bench with a signal generator and made sure it ran at 9 volts. And then I went and I ripped out the resistors and capacitors associated with the RF tube. And then I wired in this little board and it worked. And I was amazed. And I think if it didn't work, I would have been kind of taken aback, and I may not have gotten this far. But I had to leave the tube in the socket because the filaments actually were in a series string. And so everything else but the tube was gone in that circuit, and I put a new RF amplifier in. And in this manner, I went through the radio block by block. And so here's kind of schematically what I did. There's the RF section, and I went in and I erased all the parts and left in those parts, and then I added in the JFET. And this was all done while the rest of the radio was still being a tube radio and it was operating. And so you can see the before and the after there. There's a tube circuit on the left sharing, and the circuit on the right which is sharing the original components. So my test setup was I took the original loop antenna and I added a coupling loop so I could kind of inject a known signal at a known level the same time every time in. And then I used the oscilloscope in my ears to kind of let me know as I changed things whether things were still working the same. It wasn't real scientific or engineering measurement wise accurate, but it was the way I did it. And so here's a picture of the first two tubes being replaced. On the right there is the RF amplifier, and this out of form factor prototype board here is the mixer and the oscillator. And then here you see a new IF amp going in right here. And then once I got the IF amp working, I had a good IF signal at 455 kilohertz coming out of it. You know, here's the second IF transformer, and everything was good. So I ripped out everything else, all the tubes, everything. And at this point, I converted it to a single 9-volt battery. And so I finished it. and there was all the little boards that were in there, and the output section was a little bit messy. I couldn't get a single JFET to work, so I kind of just said, hey, I'll just take an integrated circuit, and I went and got an integrated circuit and I put it on there on a board that actually was used for something else. I cut that board out and pasted it in there, but I was done. I got it done. And here's a word about surface mount components. You know, I don't recommend anyone do this, but my background is electronics, and I've done this a lot in the past, but these are very, very tiny components. You got to have a microscope, tweezers, a very small soldering iron tip, a very small diameter solder to do this. And of course, you got to have a steady hand. So it's not something I can do all day long. But you can see how small this is. That's a 1/2 inch right there. And you can see the resistors. And there's a FET right there. And it was finished. And I added a few things. I added a speaker on off switch and a headphone jack, power switch on the side. The original volume control mounting was all busted up, so I didn't use that. But I did use the main tuning and had a little brass roll cloth. And there you can see the finished product. And I had a little band spread capacitor and antenna capacitor on the back. And this is just kind of a summary of what I've got to how these functional areas map onto the final schematic. And if anyone's interested in that, that's what it looked like. I don't recommend that anyone do this, but it was something I had to do, and I did it. And I'll say in summary that I really had a good time with this, and it was fun, and the fact that I could keep the radio working as I went was encouraging to me. And it works well and has very low power consumption. It didn't work so good in the AGC function, but it was good enough for me. And so I was happy with it. And who knows? I might do this again, maybe on a big communications receiver. Who knows? And there's some of my references. And so that's it. And here is the radio right here.
Wow.
You know, it's not really a portable radio anymore because, you know, it doesn't have a carrying handle or a nice case or anything, but it still works. You know, that was the timer to tell me to stop talking. Yeah, well, it works okay. I don't know. It's picking up a lot of the computer monitor noise too. So
that was just wonderful, Tom. I enjoyed that. It brings back the days when I thought I had a pretty good grip on vacuum tubes as a kid. And then all of a sudden, solid state came to be. And that was a mixed blessing. I was no longer getting terrible electric shocks. But I had to relearn a whole bunch of stuff. And I don't think I really recognized the ability of FETs to take over like that. I think it's extraordinary. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Well, thanks, Tom. Yeah, like I say, this maybe it's a little too technical of a presentation for the virtual forum, but I wanted to share that with everybody. And
I noticed you looked like you were working with 1206 size surface mount parts. That's about the smallest that I want to play with on surface mount.
yeah, those were actually, for the most part, those were 805s. Yeah, my threshold is below that. 603s I won't touch. You know.
By the way, for everybody, those numbers mean the millimeter dimensions of the part. So it's 8 millimeters by 4 or 6 millimeters by 3 or 12 millimeters by whatever.
So Tom, that I don't have any questions. I'll need to watch the recording again before I can come up with questions, I think. But oh my God, that was amazing. The work was amazing, and the presentation that you put together was very impressive. So, just as an audience member, thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Matt. Yeah, I appreciate that comment. And not everybody in the forum that shows up is it's technical. I realize that, but it overlaps. There's a lot of interesting stuff there, and
well, Tom, if I may, it isn't about just the technical stuff. It's about how you went about it from a project viewpoint. I mean, you had a vision, you figured out the process. A lot of stuff that we do as hobbyists is figuring out how to do it, and you did a good job explaining how you got there. I mean, everything you did applies to troubleshooting a radio as well. If it isn't working in the first place, you got to start someplace and work your way through it. So I don't know that the technical portion was the whole story. I think the whole story was much bigger than the technical portion.
well, thanks. I'm glad you recognize that, and I did want to kind of just hope that some of my personal aspects came out in that, what motivated me and my background a little bit. So I had fun with it, and there were times along the way that I wondered what I was doing, because I have plenty of radios. Didn't really need another one, but this is a special project, and so I'll keep it just as a reminder of when I have an idea, I can follow it through to completion. So what the poll is trying to ask the audience here is, would you please be a presenter in the future? And we sometimes we just don't have enough presentations, and so we have to scramble and find them. And it's really what keeps this whole thing going. It keeps our YouTube channel well visited, is to have these presentations. So contact us via email, and please consider being a presenter, because it's what makes this whole thing work.
I also want to make a pitch. If anybody's willing to write an article based on your presentation to put in ARCI News, I would really appreciate it.
One of the things about this club is we do a lot of different things, and the virtual forum and having the newsletter published, that all keeps a lot of interest in the club. So if you can contribute to that in any way, please do so. Okay, we're going to do some show and tells, and I know we've got a couple, and then Tom will do a brief update on the swap meets, and then we'll do any items wanted, items for sale, and go open on that. So at this point then, I will open it up for show and tells. Okay, Tom, you want to show us something?
Yeah, okay. I'll run through a real quickie on Phil Weingarten. I've always been fascinated by him. I have a presentation. Phil Weingarten was an amazing guy. He lived from 1914 to 1998. And during that time, he collected an amazing number of radios. And then he decided, for reasons that I don't understand, to begin faking radios and selling them as though they were the real thing. And he had a little shop on Canal Street that I visited as a kid. I was able to enjoy Radio Row in those days, and he was really a nasty type down there. He would kick people out of his shop if he didn't like them. So I'm quite fascinated by Phil, and I thought I would put together a lengthy presentation. I've given it at AWA, but might be fun here if people would like it. I'm just going to give a very short version of it now. During the time that Phil was active, Canal Street and Radio Row was fabulous. And as a kid, I loved it. You could go down there and you could pick up radio sets. And these guys were getting rid of radio sets that they couldn't fix in these shops. And at the end of the day, they would put them in a big pile and say 25 cents a piece. And at the very end of the day, you could just walk away with all these radios. So I just filled up my room with lots and lots of old broken radios and learned about and enjoyed radios in those days. But here was Phil. And he had this shop full of equipment. He had collected an amazing number of tubes himself. And this is his original workbench where he repaired radios. And this is just a very, very small part of his collection. He collected the cream of the cream in radios, the very beautiful old radios. And for some reason, he decided that he was going to use his collection as a model for faking radios and selling them to people. He also had an extraordinary tube collection. And for some reason, he decided, I can't imagine why he did this, but he decided he was going to blow his own tubes and sell them as original DeForest, Audions, and others. So that's just amazing to me. I'm just going to run through very quickly. He made counterfeit telegraph keys. He didn't just make the typical telegraph keys. He made keys that he could sell for a lot of money. And this is a Massey key. He counterfeited it. The only way you can tell it's a counterfeit is to look real close at the label and to unscrew the knob and see that it has a cadmium plated rather than a brass screw holding the knob on. He sold these things for $7,000, which was a pretty hefty amount of money in those days. And he knew people were going to catch him at this. So he kept a loaded Luger under the seat in his sofa in his living room for people that came after him. And he never gave anybody money back. And so he had a lot of people that hated his guts. Here's another example of his telegraph keys. This is a Marconi key. His key is on the bottom, the genuine Marconi on the top. He was a little lazy about making the bend in the lever, as you can see, and the real giveaway is in his labels. He also made counterfeit radios. Look at this beautiful, beautiful DeForest Audion with the tube. And he sold these things for a great deal of money. And it turned out that not only did he fake the radios, but he blew the tubes himself. So here is a close-up of the Phil Weingarten plate on that radio. And here is a whole bunch of these plates that he had made up to allow him to construct more of these radios. Here are some of his counterfeit tubes, and it really difficult to tell a counterfeit Phil Weingarten tube from the real thing. He blew his own tubes with a setup that started out like this. This was his original tube blowing plant. You can see a Bunsen burner there and a couple of needle fires that allow you to shape the tube. And he was able to make a fake Marconi coherer that he sold lots of. I've come across a number of these. The only way you can tell that this is a Weingarten fake is to look down at the kind of thread that he used to tie it onto that the patent rod that he has underneath it. Again, here's a better picture of it. He did a great job, and they even engraved Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company Limited on this ivory knob. So he was very meticulous. Here he is in the more developed version of his tube blowing shop, and you can see him in the process of making some tubes there. And these are crossfires, part of his tube making equipment. And here's a close-up of a relatively easy tube to make. You only have a filament and a grid and a plate. And so you can hang those inside a piece of glass, and they all work. There's no question about that, but they aren't deforest audions. He was caught by a number of AWA people. He did very bad things for AWA. He sold these fake audions, and these are just samples of articles that were written about him in the Antique Wireless Association Journal. Watch out for this guy, he's doing this and that and the other thing. And so he was kicked out of AWA for doing this, and for a good thing. And after he died, his stuff ended up in flea market. So that's a real quickie on Phil Weingarten. And if you want to see the whole thing, you have to suffer through maybe 45 minutes of more details. Over and out.
Well,
That was really
great.
excellent.
Thanks for that.
Where were you a professor, Tom?
I was at Columbia University, professor in neuroscience. So I got to play with all kinds of electronics and pretend I was a professor. I have another talk that you can actually find on YouTube, and that was growing up a ham in New York City, and my career on Radio Row and stuff like that, or I could do that here, whatever.
Yeah, we should talk offline.
Yeah, that's great. Appreciate that. Okay. Any questions for Tom on the show and tell there? Okay, any other show and tells?
I've got one. It's nowhere near as good as that one, but I've got one. I'm going to do a quick screen share. Tube boxes. If you go and try and buy tube boxes, they're pretty expensive. And Uline, which is a company that makes packing materials, and they happen to be headquartered nearby here, has what they call reverse tuck cartons. And that's the good news. The bad news is you got to buy 500 at a time.
Oh.
And so I bought the 2x2x5, which is right here. Yeah, they fit G-type tubes and O1s, and most of the early stuff. And once you get to a metal tube, they're way too big, but they're also too small for a 50. But the bulk of stuff that you have a lot of. They are. It's $92 for a case plus $20 shipping. So that was, and it came the next day. They do make them in white, but the selection in white is substantially less than the craft paper. Come down here, the white cartons, you can see there's fewer. The other thing is, of course, they don't go small enough for miniature tubes. And 1.5 and 1.5 is a little bit too small for most tubes, so that's why I jumped to 2x2. I was measuring up original tube boxes in my basement before I ordered these things. So, here's the real thing. So there's one. So obviously 500 of these things is about 3 lifetime supplies. So even though we're not doing for sale stuff, I will have these things at the next radio meet for anybody that wants them, for what I paid for them, basically. So that's all I've got.
Thank you, Tom. Any other show and tells?
Yeah, I've got one. So I picked up this radio just yesterday, 2 days ago, and noticed something odd about it. It looks like your typical table radio, and that's what I thought it was. I looked at this and didn't see anything unusual at first, until I pulled that cord out. It's like, oh my God, this is a battery radio. I've never seen a battery radio in this form factor. Grabbed the schematic, and turns out, this is a Stewart Warner radio from 1947, but there you go. 90 volts B plus and 1.5 volts for the filaments. So who would have thought? Never seen that before.
So basically there was no room for the batteries, right?
Yeah, no room for the batteries, and looks like a small table radio.
Thanks, Matt. That is the conclusion of the show and tells. And so at this point, before we press on to some other open business, I'm going to say thanks everyone for being here today for our 27th virtual forum. And I hope to see you all next time in January. And I want to thank all the members of ARCI and all the other clubs that have joined us here today. So with that, I'll be signing off.